Dive watches can be the most predictable genre of watch design, and for good reason. They have to follow a set of rules and they fulfill a certain purpose. This is the genre's biggest strength as well as its biggest weakness in some ways. But not all dive watches follow these same rules. Some of them take their own path while still adhering to the needs of the genre. My name is Blake Bettner, I'm the managing editor of Worn & Wound. Today we're taking an inside look at some of the dive watches in my collection, and 3 in particular that take their own unique approach to the dive watch design genre while still fulfilling the needs of a typical dive watch. Now, the story of the modern dive watch goes back to the early 50s and begins with the Rolex Submariner and the Blancpain 50 Fathoms. The Rolex Submariner has gone on to become kind of the archetype of the modern dive watch. And a lot of the dive watches that we see released today follow this same formula in some way, shape, or form. It's a rotating bezel, a highly legible dial, and pretty good lume. It's a straightforward design that has worked well for the Submariner since 1953, and it's changed surprisingly little over that time. So it's no surprise to see other watch brands adhere to this same formula that's worked so well for Rolex over the generations. Now, it's a formula that works, and I'm a big proponent of saying watches are what we make of them. And I often find that a good dive watch makes for a good everyday tool watch because it's highly legible, it's easy to use, it's easy to read, and it's got some practical components too, such as the rotating bezel, which can be used to time a multitude of things, not just your dive time or your time at the bottom or anything like that. These are just practical everyday features that are easy to work into your everyday life depending on your individual use case. I think this is a big reason that the dive watch appeals to me so much, as I found it to be such a useful tool for my day-to-day life, and I find myself connecting to the design codes that are most associated with a typical dive watch. And that's great. I think watches like the Rolex Submariner work really well, and there's nothing wrong with them. Do we see too many of them out there? Maybe, but it's easy to see why. But there are plenty of dive watches that take a more interesting route. And there are 3 watches from my own collection that I think tell a story of watches that do this really well. And they aren't afraid to kind of step outside of the mold and take their own approach to fulfilling the needs of a good dive watch. They are highly legible, they're easy to use, but they bring their own unique approach to the design. I want to start with a newer watch from a French brand called Sarica. This is the 5303. It is a dive watch, and they pitch it as a dive watch that also has the ability to work well in formal situations. There's certainly a slightly luxurious feel to this watch, but it has many of the components that we typically associate with dive watches. And I don't mean just a rotating bezel. Of course it has that, but its approach to the bezel is interesting here in that it splits it into 2 planes, one to account for the minutes and one to account for the hours. This is something we don't see all that often, but not only does it add another level of practicality to the bezel itself, perhaps more importantly, or just as important for me, it adds a unique visual identity to the watch, which is something that I look for and enjoy in dive watches. And then the closer you look, the more interesting details you'll start to find, from the finishing on the lug that gives it kind of a twisted look, to this integrated end link that connects to the mesh bracelet here, to the dial itself, which moves the hour markers much deeper into the dial and connects them to the chapter ring via these long indexes. It's a lot of interesting features that make for a very distinctive approach to the dive watch, and I applaud Sarica for doing it, especially as a young brand. I think it's easy to follow in the footsteps of the more well-established design codes for a lot of young brands looking to make a dive watch. So taking a risky approach like this and really doing their own thing takes a lot of bravery, and I think it really panned out well for them. And this is only one iteration of this watch. They've expanded on this a little bit with different colorways, but they all feel distinctly Sarica, which is a very good thing in this genre. Another watch that goes back a little bit further is from a brand that you might not be familiar with. It's called Prometheus. This is a watch called the Ocean Diver. And this is a watch that takes an entirely clean sheet approach to the concept of a dive watch. It has a super compressor style case with a second crown up here at 2 o'clock that adjusts the internally rotating bezel. And most of the time when we get internal rotating bezels, it feels a little bit like an afterthought. It's kind of small and difficult to read. Here, it takes up plenty of real estate, and it really feels like a practical component of the watch, which is, of course, is an important hallmark of a dive watch. This watch also brings the 12, 6, and 9 to the dial and has a day and date complication over at 3 o'clock. And the style in which each of these things have been done is very unique to this watch, and it makes the Ocean Diver something of an outlier in terms of dive watches, especially from about 10 years ago ago, which this watch is from. It's a little bit chunkier, which I don't mind. Dive watches are of course meant to be tools, so when they take that approach to their design, it seems to make sense, and this one certainly does in the context of the whole. But this is another watch that is separated by these kind of small details. It's not really following any of the design trend, it's making its own way, and it really pays off for them. This is another watch that you really kind of are drawn in to the small details, such as the knurling on the crown here, which is really interesting, the shape of the lollipop seconds hand, and then the slightly thinner hour and minute hand, which is something that we don't often see on dive watches. Generally lean towards much chunkier, thicker minute hands particular, so that it's easy to read underwater. However, most of the people wearing dive watches aren't actual divers, so they're not putting them to use in the context of an underwater situation, so I have no problem with Prometheus going this route on the ocean diver. This is a watch that we did a misreview with last year, so we've got a lot more of my in-depth thoughts on this watch on Worn and Wound. We'll link that down below. The third watch that I want to move on to here is an Omega Seamaster 300, which of course has been around for a long time as well, and you could easily consider having a nearly equal heritage as something along the lines of a Submariner. But this one is a little bit different, and I think the Seamaster is a little bit different for a few ways, which we'll get into. This particular watch is reference 2231.50. This is the fully titanium Seamaster 300 from the very early 2000s. This watch is great for a few reasons. I really love how slim the case is, and it's still 300 meters of water resistance. That's 1,000 feet, more than enough for any recreational diving that might be happening. And of course, this brings the kind of typical 90s Seamaster 300 design style here, which is a riff on original Seamasters, but it's not as straight through an evolution as something like the Submariner. And the Seamaster is of course no stranger to taking that approach. The Seamaster has spawned all kinds of different dive watches, from the extreme, like the Ploprof, to much more everyday approachable divers. It's a very broad collection with a diverse set of designs to appreciate. This one in particular, I think, is what most people that have been around for a while associate with the Seamaster. And there's a lot of flair to this design, from the broadsword hands to the kind of oversized hour marker at 12 o'clock there, to the bezel insert here. And of course, it has the helium release valve up here at the 10 o'clock position, something that still exists to this day on the Seamaster 300. However, it feels integrated in a much more organic way in this particular watch. And then looking closer at the dial, you'll notice some of the details like that wave pattern, that tight wave pattern that we so associate with the Seamaster is here, but it doesn't really overpower the rest of the design. This is a design that might fall into love it or hate it territory, but putting this particular reference on the wrist, it starts to make a lot more sense. And then moving to the case, you'll notice details like this true twisted lug, which is a detail that we associate with other Omega watches as well, brought in beautifully here in kind of a subtle way that doesn't deter from any details on the bezel or dial, but it's one that pays dividends on the wrist. A couple of my favorite small details about this watch are the way that the crown guard is integrated into the shape of the side of the case along the 3 o'clock side, and the integration of the date window, which feels very seamless. It doesn't call attention to itself. It's kind of there when you need it and not there when you don't, which is a detail that I appreciate about these dive watches. The focal point is clearly on the hour markers and the minute hand, this kind of oversized, large, broadsword minute hand. It's very easy to read and tell time against, and again, all these things make it a very practical, easy watch to wear every single day. All right, these are 3 interesting dive watches from my collection that kind of break the mold of the dive watch archetype in really interesting ways, from modern micro brands to old school micro brands that maybe aren't around anymore, to stalwarts from the likes of Omega. I think all 3 of these watches offer a really great opportunity to appreciate the dive watch genre without having to go into the more established realms. That's certainly done very well, but if you're looking to expand your experience of the genre as a whole, there are a lot of other watches out there that offer a unique experience compared to what we're used to seeing. And that's why they've ultimately found a place in my collection and why I appreciate them so much. This has been an inside look at my collection at dive watches that break the mold. I'd love to hear your thoughts on divers that get away from the typical dive watch formula. What do you appreciate about them? And we'd love to hear some examples from you. We'd love to hear some surprises down there too. If you enjoy this content, please be sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us out a lot. And until next time, take care.